In 2003, a bold experiment launched in the realm of massively multiplayer online games, Star Wars Galaxies. It was not merely an MMORPG, it was a living, evolving game, a place where freedom, choice, and social interaction were not just features, but the foundation of its very design. Players could forge entire societies, wield political power, and influence the economy, all while inhabiting a world rich with narrative, culture, and consequence. 2 decades later, despite the official servers having long since gone offline, the spirit of this game endures. Its philosophy, its community, and its legacy continue to thrive, preserved by passionate fans and emulator communities alike. But what made this universe so enduring? And why does it still captivate the imagination of players new and old? Today, we explore the profound philosophy, remarkable life cycle, and living legacy of Star Wars Galaxies. Star Wars Galaxies was conceived during a transformative period in gaming's history, when MMORPGs were beginning to experiment with player agency for the first time. The central philosophy of the game was radical, player freedom above all else. Unlike traditional RPGs, which relied heavily on linear narratives and rigid class systems, Star Wars Galaxies allowed players to define their roles entirely. Players could pursue conventional heroic paths, becoming a Jedi Knight, a bounty hunter, or even a soldier, but equally, they could engage in commerce, politics, and crafting. The game's system encouraged specialization and collaboration. The economy was complex and emergent. Player-run markets determined supply and demand. Crafting skills were critical for advancement, and social structures developed organically. This philosophy was not without risk. By prioritizing freedom over scripted guidance, the developers embraced unpredictability. Communities would rise and fall based on player decisions, sometimes in ways the designers could not have anticipated. Yet it is precisely this unpredictability, this emphasis on emergent storytelling, that granted the game its profound sense of authenticity. Consider the urban centers of the game: Mos Eisley, Naboo, Corellia. These were not mere backdrops, they were ecosystems, inhabited by players who organized political factions, ran businesses, and staged events. The philosophy of living in the world rather than merely completing it set Star Wars Galaxies apart from virtually every other MMO of its day. To fully understand the life cycle of Star Wars Galaxies requires us to examine several key stages in the game's development. The pre-combat upgrade, which took place from 2003 to 2005, was truly the grand sandbox experiment era of the game. When Star Wars Galaxies launched in June of 2003, it represented one of the most ambitious attempts to simulate a living virtual society ever attempted. Developed by Sony Online Entertainment, the game was conceived as a true sandbox experience within the Star Wars universe. Unlike most RPGs of the time, the game did not rely on traditional character classes. Instead, players selected from a large network of interconnected skill trees representing professions such as bounty hunter, weaponsmith, entertainer, medic, architect, smuggler, and dozens more. Players could mix and match these skills freely, producing hybrid characters with unique identities and capabilities. This system created an ecosystem of interdependence. Combat-focused characters depended on artisans for equipment. Traders relied on scouts to locate rare resources. Entertainers provided essential buffs that accelerated healing and reduced fatigue after battles. The in-game economy that emerged from this system was almost entirely player-driven. Nearly every weapon, piece of armor, vehicle, and starship was crafted by players using raw materials harvested from planets like Tatooine, Corellia, and Naboo. These resources constantly rotated in quality and availability, meaning master crafters needed to continuously explore and adapt in order to maintain their reputations. Player cities were another defining feature of this era. Groups of players could establish settlements in the wilderness, construct housing and infrastructure, elect mayors, and even define municipal policies such as taxes and zoning permissions. Entire communities formed around these cities, often developing district identities and rivalries with neighboring settlements. Perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the game was the path to becoming a Jedi. The developers deliberately hid the requirements for unlocking the Jedi profession. Players speculated endlessly about the conditions needed to unlock it, experimenting with various combinations of professions and sharing rumors across forums and in-game cantinas. This secrecy reinforced the lore of Star Wars Galaxies, where Jedi were rare and elusive figures rather than common player characters. The result of all these systems was a galaxy that felt genuinely alive. The stories that emerged were not scripted by developers, but created organically by the players themselves. Yet beneath this vibrant sandbox, cracks were beginning to appear in some of the game's underlying systems. As the player population grew and the complexity of the mechanics became more apparent, developers began confronting a difficult reality. The very systems that made the galaxy feel so deep and immersive were also becoming increasingly difficult to balance and maintain. By 2004 and early 2005, the original combat system of Star Wars Galaxies was beginning to show signs of strain. These early signs of strain led directly into what many in the Star Wars Galaxies community refer to as the combat upgrade era. The original combat system in Star Wars Galaxies relied on a complicated set of statistics, including a health, action, and mind pool where damage was distributed across all three pools. Armor types, weapon types, and resistances interacted in complicated ways that could be difficult for a new player to understand. Certain profession combinations became dramatically more powerful than others, leading to balance issues within the game in both PvE and PvP environments. At the same time, the MMO market was evolving rapidly. Games were beginning to emphasize clarity, accessibility, and faster progression for the players. In response, Sony Online Entertainment introduced the Combat Upgrade, commonly abbreviated as the CU, in April of 2005. The Combat Upgrade was intended to refine and rebalance the existing systems without completely discarding the sandbox philosophy of the original game. Several major changes were introduced at this time. First, the developers simplified combat calculations. Damage systems were streamlined, and the three-pool combat system was adjusted to make combat outcomes more easy to understand. Secondly, the profession system was partially reorganized. While the open skill tree structure remained intact, certain professions were rebalanced or restructured to clarify their intended roles. Third, combat pacing was adjusted to make encounters feel more responsive and less dependent on obscure statistical interactions. From a design standpoint, the combat upgrade represented an attempt to modernize the game while preserving its core sandbox identity. However, the reaction from the player base was mixed at best. Some players welcomed the improvements to clarity and balance, while others felt that the CU weakened certain professions and disrupted established playstyles. More importantly, the CU revealed a growing tension between two competing visions for the game. One vision prioritized depth, complexity, and emergent gameplay, while the other prioritized accessibility, balance, and broader appeal to a larger audience. Eventually, this philosophical conflict would lead to a far more dramatic transformation of the game. Enter the new game enhancements era. Only a few months after the combat upgrade's release, Sony Online Entertainment introduced a far more sweeping overhaul, the New Game Enhancements, or abbreviated as the NGE. While the CU had attempted to refine existing systems, the NGE fundamentally replaced them. The most dramatic change was the elimination of the open-ended skill tree. In its place, the game introduced a fixed set of 9 professions, including soldier, officer, spy, smuggler, and Jedi. This shift dramatically simplified character progression. Instead of experimenting with hybrid skill combinations, players now advanced along predetermined paths similar to those found in more traditional MMOs. Combat mechanics were also redesigned to resemble a more action-oriented shooter experience. Targeting systems changed, ability rotations were simplified, and combat became faster and more visually dynamic. However, the most controversial change involved the Jedi profession. Previously, becoming a Jedi had been an extremely rare achievement, requiring extensive experimentation and dedication by the player. Under the new game enhancements, however, Jedi became a starting class available to new players. From a marketing perspective, the reasoning was straightforward. Jedi were the most iconic figure in the Star Wars franchise, and making them accessible to new players seemed like a logical way to attract a new audience. However, for many longtime veterans of the game, this decision fundamentally altered the identity of the game. The original version of Star Wars Galaxies had emphasized a lived-in galaxy where ordinary citizens, smugglers, traders, entertainers, and soldiers formed the backbone of the society. The NGE shifted the focus towards a more traditional hero fantasy centered around Jedi characters. The reaction from the community was immediate and intense. Large number of players canceled their subscriptions, and the NGE quickly became one of the most controversial updates in the history of online games. Despite the backlash surrounding the new game enhancements, Star Wars Galaxies did not disappear. Instead, it entered a quieter but surprisingly resilient phase. The player base was smaller, but those who remained were deeply committed to the world they had spent years inhabiting. During this period, new expansions such as Rage of the Wookiees and Trials of Obi-Wan entered the galaxy with additional planets and storylines, including adventures on Kashyyyk and Mustafar. Meanwhile, the community itself adapted to the new systems. Guilds reorganized around the revised profession structure. Player-run events became increasingly important. Role-playing communities hosted elaborate narratives involving political intrigue, faction conflicts, and social gatherings. Cantinas remained vibrant social spaces where entertainers performed music and dance routines while players gathered to trade stories and plan their next adventure. Even though the game had changed dramatically, the social infrastructure built by its players continued to function. This period demonstrated the remarkable resilience of player-driven communities. Even after a major design shift, the relationships, traditions, and institutions formed during the early years of the game continued to persist. However, despite the resilience of the existing player base, Sony Online Entertainment would eventually announce the formal shutdown of Star Wars Galaxies in early 2011. One major factor behind the decision was the impending release of Star Wars: The Old Republic, a new MMORPG developed by BioWare. On December 15, 2011, the official servers went offline. But unlike most MMOs, Star Wars Galaxies did not simply vanish. Years earlier, dedicated fans had begun reverse engineering the server architecture of the game in an effort to preserve its original vision. This effort eventually evolved into SWG EMU, an ambitious community-driven project aimed at recreating the pre-combat upgrade version of the game as faithfully as possible. Today, multiple emulator servers exist, each preserving different interpretations of the game's history, some focusing on the pre-CU sandbox, while others recreated the CU or even NGE eras of the game. These emulator servers are not maintained by corporations, but by passionate volunteers and players who believed the original version of Star Wars Galaxies was the peak of the game. Remarkably, decades after its original release, players continue to build cities, run businesses, host Cantina performances, and explore the galaxy just as they had before. The official servers may be gone, but the galaxy itself continues to endure, sustained by the very force that made it special in the first place: its players. More than 20 years after its initial release, the legacy of Star Wars Galaxies remains one of the most fascinating stories in the history of online games. It was not perfect. Its systems were often overly complicated, sometimes unbalanced, and occasionally misunderstood even by its very developers. But it accomplished something remarkably rare. It created a world where the most important stories were not written by the developers, they were written by the players who lived them. Cities rose and fell in the deserts of Tatooine. Trade networks stretched across the stars. Cantinas became social hubs where strangers became allies, rivals, and even lifelong friends. In many ways, the galaxy was never just a game. It was a community experiment, one that proved how powerful player-driven worlds could be. And remarkably, that experiment still persists to this very day. Dedicated fan communities continued to keep the galaxy alive through emulator projects like Star Wars Galaxies EMU, Star Wars Galaxies Restoration 3, and Star Wars Galaxies Legends, each one offering a different interpretation of the original experience. Whether you're interested in the pre-combat upgrade era, the combat upgrade, or the latter NGE era gameplay, there's something for everyone to experience and enjoy the magic that was Star Wars Galaxies. So if you've never experienced Star Wars Galaxies, or if you're a veteran player feeling the pull of the universe once more, there has never been a better time to step back into the galaxy and see what made it so special to those who lived it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history and philosophy of Star Wars Galaxies, consider helping the channel by leaving a like, subscribing, and sharing this video with others, as it greatly helps the channel's reach. Comment down below what deep dives you would like to see in future videos. That's my rant, and thanks for watching.